Chapter 18. Just before dawn, the storm blew itself out with one last angry roar. It started snowing. A frozen silence settled over the canebrake. Back in the thick timber of the river bottoms, the sharp snapping of frozen limbs could be heard. The tall stalks of wild canes looked exhausted from a hellish night. They were drooped and bending from the weight of the frozen sleet. I climbed out of the deep gully and listened for my dogs. I couldn't hear them, and just as I started back down the bank I heard something, and I listened, and again I heard the sound. Pa was watching me. "Can you hear the dogs?" he said. "No, not the dogs, but I can hear something." "What's it sound like?" "Well, it sounds like someone whooping," I said. Pa and the judge hurried up the bank, and we heard the sound again. It was coming from a different direction. "Well, the first time I heard it, it was over that way." "Well, that must be the men from camp," the judge said. "They must be searching for us." Well, we started a whooping, and the searchers answered. Their voices came from all directions. The first one to reach us was Mr. Kyle. He looked haggard and tired. He asked if everything was all right. "Yeah, we're all right, but the old man has a bad ankle. It looks like we're going to have to carry him out." "Well, your team broke loose and came back to camp about midnight," Mr. Kyle said. This really spooked us. We were sure something bad had happened, so 25 of us have been searching since then." Several men started down the bank and went over to Grandpa. They looked at his ankle, and one said, "Well, I don't think it's broken, but it sure is a bad sprain." "Well, you're in luck," another one said. "We have one of the best doctors in the state of Texas in our camp, Dr. Charlie Lawman. He'll have him fixed up in no time." "Yeah, and if I know Charlie, he'll probably have a small hospital with him." Back in the crowd I heard another man say, "You mean that Loth fella who owns them black and tan hounds? He's a doctor?" "Sure is one of the best." Mr. Kyle asked where my dogs were, and I told him they were treed somewhere. "What do you mean, treed somewhere?" he said. Pa explained what had happened. With a wide-eyed look on his face, he said, "Do you mean to tell me those hounds stayed with the tree in that blizzard?" I nodded. Looking at me, said, "Son, I hope they do have that coon treed, 'cause you need that one to win the cup. Those two Walker hounds, they caught 3 before the storm came up, and when it got bad, all the hunters they could have done come in." The judge spoke up. "I'll always believe that those hounds knew that boy needed another coon to win. If you fellers have seen some of the things those dogs had done, you'd believe it too." One hunter walked over to the broken stag. 3 out of 1 tree, he said. "No wonder, look here. That old snag was half full of leaves and grass. Why, that's a regular old den tree." Several of the men walked over, and I heard one say, "Well, I seen this happen before. Remember that big hunt there in the Red River bottoms, when the 2 little beagle hounds, they treed 4 coons and an old holler snag? They won that championship, too." "Well, I wasn't there, but I remember reading about it," one said. "Say, I don't see Benson," Mr. Kyle said. The men started looking at each other. "Well, he was searching further down river than the rest of us. Maybe he didn't hear us a-shouting." Some of the men climbed out of the gully. They started a whooping, and from a distance they heard an answering shout. "Oh, he hears us. Here he's a-coming." Everyone looked relieved. Mr. Benson struck the washout a little way above us, and he was breathing hard as he had been running. He started talking as soon as he was within hearing distance. "Well, I was scared when I first saw them," he said. "I didn't know what they were. They looked like white ghosts. I never did see anything like it." A hunter grabbed Mr. Benson by the shoulder, shaking him. Get a hold of yourself, man. What you be talking about? Mr. Benson took a deep breath to control himself and started again in a much calmer voice. Those two hounds, I found them. They're frozen solid, nothing but white tips from the tips of their nose to the ends of their tippy tails. Hearing Mr. Benson's word, I screamed and ran to my father. Everything started whirling around and around. I felt light as a feather, my knees buckled, and I knew no more. Regaining consciousness, I opened my eyes and could dimly see the blurred images of the men around me. A hand was shaking me, and I could hear my father's voice, but I couldn't understand his words. Little by little, the blackness faded away, and my voice was dry, and I was terribly thirsty, and I asked for some water. Mr. Benson came over, and he said, Son, I'm sorry, truly sorry. I didn't mean it that way. Your dogs, they're alive. I was just excited. I'm awfully sorry, son. I heard a deep voice say, That's a hell of a thing to do, come running in here and saying that the dogs are frozen solid. Mr. Benson said, I didn't mean it to sound that way. I said I'm sorry. What more do you want me to do? The deep voice growled again. I think it's still a hell of a thing for a man to do. Mr. Kyle took over. Now let's not have any more of this. We have work to do. We've been here standing acting like a bunch of school kids. All this time that old man's out there laying there suffering, and a couple of you fellers, you best go cut 2 poles and make a stretcher to carry him. And while the men were getting the poles, Pa heated the coonskins again and wrapped them around Grandpa's foot. With belts and long leather laces from their boots, the hunters made a stretcher. Very gently they put Grandpa on it, and again Mr. Kyle took command. Part of us will start for camp with him. The others, they'll go after the dogs. Here, take this gun, Pa said. I'll go with them. Looking at me, Mr. Kyle said, Well, come on, son. I want to see your hounds. Mr. Benson led the way. Well, as soon as we get out of this cane, we may be able to hear 'em. They have the coon tree and a big black gum tree. You're gonna see a sight now, I mean a sight. They done walked a ring around that tree clear down to the ice and snow, and you can see the bare ground. I wonder why they did that, someone asked. I don't know, Mr. Benson replied, unless they ran in that circle to keep from freezing to death or to keep that coon treed. I figured I knew why my dogs were covered with ice. The coon had probably crossed the river, maybe several times, and old Dan and little Ann would have followed him. They had come out of the river with their coats dripping wet, and the freezing blast of the blizzard had done the rest. Nearing the tree, we stopped and stared. Now, did you ever see anything like that? When I saw them there, I thought they was white wolves. My dogs hadn't seen us when we came up. They were trotting around and around, just as Mr. Benson had said. We could see the path they had worn down through the ice and snow till the bare black earth was visible, and like ghostly white shadows around they trotted. In a low voice, someone says, They know if they stop, they'll freeze to death. Well, that's unbelievable, said Mr. Kyle. Oh, come on. We gotta do something quick. With a choking sob, I ran for my dogs. On hearing our approach, they sat down and started bawling treed. I noticed their voices didn't have that solid ring to it. Their ice-covered tails made a rattling sound as they swished that way and this on the bare, icy ground. A large fire was built. Standing my dogs close to that warm heat, the gentle hands of the hunters went to work. With handkerchiefs and scarves heated with steaming hot, little by little the ice was thawed from their bodies. If they had laid down, they would have froze to death, someone said. And they knew it, too. That's why they kept running that circle. What I can't understand is why they stayed with the tree, Mr. Benson said. I've seen hounds stay with a tree for quite a while, but not in a darn northern blizzard." "Men," said Mr. Kyle, "people have been trying to understand dogs ever since the beginning of time. One never knows what they'll do. You can read every day where a dog saved the life of a drowning child or laid down his life for his master. Some people call this loyalty. I don't, but I may be wrong, but I call it love. The deepest kind of love." After those words were spoken, a thoughtful silence settled over the men. The mood was broken back by the deep, growling voice I heard back in the washout. "It's a shame that people all over the world can't have that kind of love in their hearts," he said. "There'd be no more wars or slaughter or murder, no greed or selfishness. It would be the kind of world that God would want us to have. It'd be a wonderful world." After all the ice was thawed from my dogs and their coats were dried out, I could see they were all right. And I was happy again, and I felt good all over. One of the hunters said, "You think them coons are thawed out enough to fight a coon?" "Sure, you just run 'em out of that tree and they'll get 'em," I said. Well, at the crack of the gun, the coon ran far out onto a big limb and stopped. Again, the hunter sprinkled him with some birdshot, and this time he jumped, and hitting the ground, he crouched low. Old Dan made a lunge, and just as he reached him, the coon sprang straight up and came down on his head. Holding down with his claws, the coon sank his teeth into a long, tender ear, and old Dan was furious. He started turning in a circle, bawling with pain, and little Ann was trying hard to get a hold of that coon, but she couldn't. Because of his fast circling, old Dan's feet flew out from under him and he fell. Well, this gave little Ann a chance. Darting in, her jaws closed in on the back of the coon's neck, and I knew the fight was over. Arriving back at camp, I saw that all the tents had been taken down but ours. The hunter said, "Everyone was in a hurry to get out before another blizzard sets in." Pa told me to take my dogs into the tent, as Grandpa wanted to see them. I saw tears in my grandfather's eyes as he talked to them. His ankle was wrapped in bandages. His foot and toes were swollen to twice their normal size. They had turned a greenish-yellow color. Placing my hand on his foot, I could feel the feverish heat. Dr. Lathman came over. "Are you ready to go now?" he asked. Snorting and growling, Grandpa said, "I told you I wasn't going anywhere until I see that gold cup handed to this boy." Turning to face the crowd, Dr. Lathman said, "Boys, well, let's get this over. I want this man in town. That's one of the meanest sprains I ever seen, and it ought to be in a cast, but I don't got any plaster with me." The hunter, who'd come by our tent collecting the jackpot money, came up to me. He handed me the box and said, "Here you are, son. There's over $300 in this box, and it's all yours." Turning to the crowd, he said, "Fellas, I can always say this. On this hunt, I've seen two of the finest little coon hounds I could ever hope to see." There was a roar of approval from the crowd. Looking down, I saw the box was almost full of money. I was shaking all over, and I tried to say thanks, but it only came out as a whisper. Turning, I handed the box to my father. As his rough old hands closed over it, I saw a strange look come over his face, and he turned and looked at my dogs. And some of the men started shouting, "Here it is." The crowd parted, and the judge walked through, and I saw the gleaming metal of the gold cup in his hand. And after a short speech, he handed it to me, and saying, "Son, this makes me very proud. It's a great honor to present you with this championship cup." The crowd exploded. The hunter's shouts were deafening. I don't know from where the two silly old tears came out. They just squeezed their way out, and I felt them as they rolled down my cheeks, and one dropped on the smooth surface of the cup and splattered, and I wiped it away with my sleeve. Turning to my dogs, I knelt down and showed the cup to them. Little Ann licked it, and old Dan sniffed it one time and then turned his head away. The judge said, "Son, there's a place on the cup to engrave the names of your dogs. I could take it into Oklahoma City and have her done, or you can have it done yourself. The engraving charge has already been paid for by the association." Looking at the cup, it seemed that far down in the gleaming shadows I could see two wide blue eyes glued to a window pane. I knew that my little sister was watching the road and waiting for our return. Looking back to the judge, I said, "If you don't mind, I'll take it with me. My grandfather can send it in for me." Laughing, he said, "Oh, that's all right." He handed me a slip of paper and he said, "This is the address where you should send it." Grandpa said, "Well, now that's all settled. I'm ready to go to town." And turning to Pa, he said, "You'll have to bring the buggy in, and I wish you'd look after my stock for me. I know Grandma will want to go in with us, and there'll be no one left at home there to feed them. Tell Bill Lowry to come in and take care of the store. You'll find the keys in the usual place." "Oh, don't you worry. We'll take care of everything," Pa said. "Don't you worry about a thing. I don't intend to stop until we get back, because it looks like we're in for some more bad weather." I went over, and I kissed Grandpa goodbye. He pinched my cheek and whispered, "We'll teach them city slickers that they can't come up here and beat our dogs." I smiled. Grandpa was carried out and made comfortable in the back seat of Dr. Latham's car, and I stood and I watched as it wheezed and bounced its way out of sight. "Well, I'm harnessing the team," Pa said. "You take the tent down and pack up our gear, please." On the back seat of the buggy, I made a bed out of our bedclothes, and down on the floorboards I fixed a nice place for my dogs. All through the night, the creaking wheels of our buggy moved on, and several times I woke up. My father had wrapped a tarp about himself. Reaching down, I could feel my dogs. They were warm and comfortable. Early the next morning, we stopped for breakfast. And while Pa tended to the team, I turned my dogs loose and let them stretch. "We made good time last night. If everything goes all right, we'll be home long before dark." Reaching Grandpa's store in the middle of the afternoon, Pa said, "I'll put the team in the barn and feed the stock while you unload the buggy." Coming back from the barn, he said, "In the morning, I'll head over and tell Bill Lowry to come up here and open the store." Looking around, he said, "It snowed more here than it did where we were hunting." Feeling big and important, I said, "I don't like the looks of this weather. We'd better be scooting on home." Pa laughed. "You sure you're not in a hurry to get home to be showing off that gold cup?" he said. A smile was my only answer. 200 yards this side of our home, the road took a turn around a low foothill, shutting out our home from sight. Pa said, "You're going to see a scramble as soon as we round that bend." Well, it was more of a stampede than a scramble. The little one came out first and all but tore the screen door off its hinges, and the older girls passed her just beyond the gate. And in their hurry she slipped and fell down into the snow, and she started crying. The older girls ran up, asking for the cup. Holding it high above my head, I said, "Now wait a minute. I've got another one for you two." And I held the small silver cup out to them. And while they were fighting over it, I ran to the little one, picking her up. I brushed the snow from her long braided hair and her tear-stained face. I told her there was no use to crying. I'd brought the gold cup for her, and no one else was going to get it. Reaching for the cup, she wrapped her small arms around it, and squeezing it up tight, she ran for the house to show Mama. Ma came out onto the porch. Well, she was just as excited as the girls were, and she held out her arms, and I ran to her, and she hugged and she kissed me. "It's good to have you home again," she said. "Look what I have, Mama," the little one cried, "and it's all mine." She held the golden cup out in her two small hands. As Ma took the beautiful cup, she looked at me, and she started to say something, but was interrupted by the cries from the other girl. "We have one too, Mama," they cried, "and it's just as pretty as that one." "It is not, neither," the little one piped up in a defiant voice. "It's not even as big as mine is." "2 cups? Did you win too?" Mama exclaimed. "Yes, Ma," I said. "Little Ann won that one all by herself." The odd expression on my mother's face was wonderful to see. Holding a cup in each hand, she held them out in front of her. 2, a gold one and a silver one. Who would have thought anything so wonderful could have happened to us? I'm so proud, so very proud. Handing the cups back to the girls, she walked over to Pa. After kissing him, she said, "I just can't believe everything that has happened. I'm so glad you went along. Did you enjoy yourself?" With a smile on his face, Pa almost shouted, "Enjoy myself? Why, I never had such a time in my life." His voice trailed off to a low calm. "Well, that is, except for one thing. Grandpa, he had himself a bad accident." "Oh, yes, I know," Ma said. "One of Tom Logan's boys was at the store when they arrived. He came by and told us all about it. The doctor said it wasn't as bad as it looked, and he's pretty sure Grandpa will be home in a few days." Well, I was happy to hear this news, and I could tell by the pleased look on my father's face that he was almighty glad to hear it too. On entering the house, Pa said, "Oh, I almost forgot this." He handed the box of money to Ma. "What's this?" "Oh, it's just a little gift from old Dan and little Ann," Pa said. Ma opened the box. I could see the color drain from her face, and her hands, they started trembling. Turning her back to us, she walked over and set it on the mantel. A peaceful silence settled over the room. I could hear the clock ticking, and the fire in the fireplace crackling and popping. Turning from the mantel, Ma looked straight at us. Her lips were tightly pressed together to keep them from quivering. Walking slowly to Pa, she buried her face into his chest, and I could hear her say, "Oh, thank God. My prayers have been answered." There was a celebration in our home that night, and to me it was like a second Christmas. Ma opened a jar of huckleberries and made a large cobbler, and Pa went to the smokehouse and came back with a hickory-cured ham. We sat down to a feast of ham, huge plates of fried potatoes and ham gravy, hot cornbread and fresh butter and wild bee honey. During the course of the meal, the entire story of the championship hunt was told, some by Pa, but mostly by me. Just when everything was so perfect and peaceful, an argument sprang up between the 2 oldest girls. It seemed that each wanted to claim the silver cup, and just when they were on the verge of sawing it in two, so each of them could have their allotted share, Pa settled the squabble by giving the oldest one a silver $1. Once again, peace and harmony was restored. That night, as I was preparing for bed, a light flashed by my window. Puzzled, I tiptoed over and peeked through the pane. It was Mama. Carrying my lantern and 2 large plates heaped high with food, she headed for the doghouse. Setting the light down on the ground in front of them, she called to my dogs. And while they were eating, Ma did something I couldn't understand. She knelt down on her knees in prayer. After they'd eaten their food, Ma started petting them, and I could hear her voice but couldn't make out her words, and whatever she was saying must have pleased them, because little Ann wiggled and twisted, and even old Dan wagged his long red tail, which was very unusual. Pa came out, and I saw him put his arm around Ma, and side by side they stood for several minutes, looking at my dogs. When they turned to enter the house, I saw Ma dabbing at her eyes with her apron. Laying in bed, staring into the darkness, I tried hard to figure out the strange actions of my parents. Why had Ma knelt in prayer in front of my dogs, and why was she weeping? I was running all the whys around in my mind when I heard them talking. "I know," Pa said, "but I think there's a way. I'm going to have a talk with Grandpa. I don't think that old foot of his is ever going to be the same again, and he'll be needing some help around the store." I knew they were talking about me, but I couldn't understand what it meant. And then I thought, why, that's it. They want me to help with Grandpa. Well, that'll be all right with me. I could still hunt every night. Feeling smart for figuring out their conversation, I turned over and fell asleep. End of chapter 18.